The scorching Texas sun beat down mercilessly on the vast expanse of rangeland that stretched as far as the eye could see. James Carter sat tall in his saddle, surveying his domain from atop a weathered ridge. At 32, he owned more cattle and land than most men could dream of in 2 lifetimes. His weathered face bore the marks of countless days under the unforgiving sun, and his steel-gray eyes held the calculating coldness of a man who had learned early that sentiment had no place in business. Below him, his sprawling ranch spread out like a kingdom, 5,000 head of cattle grazing on 40,000 acres of prime Texas grassland. The Carter Ranch was the largest operation in 3 counties, built from nothing through 15 years of back-breaking work, shrewd investments, and an iron will that bent for no man. James spurred his horse, a magnificent black stallion named Tempest, down the ridge toward the main compound. The ranch hands tipped their hats as he passed, respect mingled with a healthy dose of fear in their eyes. They called him Iron Jim behind his back, not mockingly, but with the wary admiration reserved for rattlesnakes and thunderstorms. The main house stood like a fortress against the landscape, built from limestone hauled from quarries 50 miles away. 3 stories of solid construction with wide verandas and tall windows that caught the evening breeze. It was a house built for a family, for the laughter of children and the warmth of a woman's touch. Instead, it echoed with emptiness, each room a monument to James's success and solitude. "Afternoon, Mr. Carter," called out Tom Brennan, his foreman. As James dismounted near the stables, Tom was one of the few men James trusted, having ridden with him since the early days when they'd driven cattle up the Chisholm Trail together. "Tom," James acknowledged with a curt nod. "How's the western herd?" "Moving them to fresh pasture tomorrow. Found good grass near Willow Creek." "Good. Make sure the boys check for strays in those canyons. Lost 20 head there last spring." Tom nodded, hesitating before adding, "Mrs. Patterson stopped by earlier. Left another invitation for you." James's jaw tightened. Eleanor Patterson, the banker's widow, had been pursuing him with the determination of a cavalry charge for the past year. She was handsome enough, practical, and would make a suitable wife for a man of his standing. The problem was, James felt nothing when he looked at her, no spark, no warmth, just the cold calculation of a business arrangement. "Burn it," he said flatly. "She won't give up easy. Boss, woman's got her mind set on being the next Mrs. Carter." "Then she's set on disappointment." Tom chuckled dryly. "You planning on dying a bachelor ranch this size needs sons to carry it on." James fixed him with a look that would have silenced a lesser man, but Tom had known him too long to be cowed. "When I want your opinion on my personal affairs, I'll ask for it." "Just saying what everybody's thinking?" "You're richer than Midas, but what good's all this if there's nobody to leave it to?" The question hung in the air like dust after a cattle drive. James had asked himself the same thing during countless solitary evenings, sitting on his porch with only a glass of whiskey and the coyotes for company. But wanting something and finding it were 2 different things entirely. He strode into the house, his spurs ringing against the polished wood floors. The Mexican housekeeper, Rosa, had laid out his supper in the dining room, a table meant for 12, set for 1. Beefsteak, potatoes, fresh bread, all of the finest quality. He ate mechanically, tasting nothing. After supper, he retired to his study, a room lined with ledgers that told the story of his empire. Each entry represented another step away from the poverty of his youth. When his family had scratched out a meager existence on a hardscrabble farm in Missouri, his father had died broken and bitter, leaving a widow and 6 children with nothing but debt and despair. James had sworn on his father's grave that he'd never be poor again, never be at the mercy of bankers and creditors, and he'd kept that promise, building his fortune 1 cattle drive, 1 shrewd deal at a time. He'd bought out struggling ranchers, invested in the silver mines when everyone else thought them played out, and now owned shares in the railroad that was bringing civilization to the frontier. But success had come at a price. Somewhere along the way, he'd forgotten how to be anything but a businessman. The few times he'd courted women in his younger days had ended poorly. They'd wanted sweet words and gentle touches, things that had been burned out of him by the harsh realities of frontier life. He could negotiate a cattle contract that would make both parties rich, but he couldn't tell a woman she was beautiful without sounding like he was appraising livestock. A knock at the door interrupted his brooding. "Come," he called. Tom entered, hat in hand. "Sorry to bother you, boss, but thought you should know. That Masterson fellow's been sniffing around again." Dale Masterson owned the neighboring ranch, a smaller but prosperous operation. He'd been trying to buy water rights to Willow Creek for years, knowing it would give him leverage over the smaller ranchers in the area. Let him sniff. He's not getting those rights. He's offering double what they're worth. I don't care if he offers 10 times. A man who controls the water controls the land. My father taught me that much. Tom shifted uncomfortably. He's also been talking in town, saying things. What kind of things? That you're getting soft. That all this money's made you forget where you came from. That maybe it's time for new blood in these parts. James's eyes narrowed dangerously. Is that so? Just repeating what I heard. Man's got a mouth on him, and there's some who listen. Then maybe it's time I reminded Mr. Masterson why they call this the Carter Ranch. After Tom left, James poured himself 3 fingers of bourbon and stood by the window, looking out at his domain bathed in moonlight. The ghost of his reflection stared back from the glass, a successful man, a feared man, a respected man, but also a lonely man, though he'd never admit it aloud. The next morning came early. As it always did on a working ranch, James was in the saddle before dawn, riding out to inspect the herds. The morning air was crisp, carrying the scent of sage and dust. This was when he felt most alive, most connected to something greater than ledgers and bank accounts. He'd planned to check the eastern pastures, but Tempest had other ideas. Pulling toward the south, James gave the stallion his head, trusting the animal's instincts. They'd been partners for 7 years, and Tempest had never led him astray. The trail wound through a series of low hills, following an ancient path carved by centuries of buffalo migrations. As they crested a rise, James heard the sound of laughter carried on the wind. He reined in sharply, his hand instinctively moving to the Colt .45 on his hip. Below, near the swimming hole where Willow Creek pooled before continuing its journey across his land, a group of town children were playing. Their mothers sat on the bank, keeping watch while mending clothes and gossiping. It was a scene of simple happiness, the kind James had rarely witnessed and never been part of. One of the women spotted him and quickly alerted the others. The laughter died as surely as if he'd fired a shot. Mothers gathered their children protectively, whispering urgently. Within minutes, they were packing up their things, preparing to flee. "You don't have to leave," James called out, but his voice came out harsher than intended, more command than invitation. "We're sorry, Mr. Carter," one of the braver women stammered. "We didn't mean no harm. The children just wanted to cool off, and—" "I said you don't have to leave." He tried to soften his tone, but the damage was done. They scattered like quail before a hawk, children clutching their mother's skirts, casting frightened glances over their shoulders. James sat on his horse, watching them go, something hollow echoing in his chest. When had he become the monster that mothers used to frighten their children into obedience? When had his success transformed him from a man into a legend that inspired more fear than respect? The swimming hole returned to its natural quiet, disturbed only by the whisper of wind through the cottonwoods. James dismounted and led Tempest to the water's edge, letting the horse drink while he studied his reflection in the still pool. The face that looked back was harder than he remembered, marked by lines that spoke of determination rather than laughter. What good's all this if there's nobody to leave it to? Tom's question echoed in his mind. As if in answer, a red-tailed hawk circled overhead, crying its lonely call to the empty sky. James remounted and turned Tempest toward home, but the image of those frightened children stayed with him. He'd built an empire, but at what cost? He'd become the richest man in 3 counties. But wealth hadn't brought him happiness, only isolation. That evening, he stood on his porch, watching the sun paint the sky in shades of crimson and gold. His ranch hands were heading to their bunkhouse, voices carrying across the yard as they joked and told stories. Through the windows of the married men's quarters, he could see families gathering for supper, children being tucked into bed, wives kissing their husbands good night. James Carter had everything a man could want: land, cattle, money, power. But as another night fell over his empire, he couldn't shake the feeling that he had nothing at all. The house behind him stood ready to shelter a family that didn't exist, to echo with laughter that never came. He didn't know it yet, but fate was already setting in motion the events that would shatter his carefully ordered world. Sometimes the universe has a way of giving us what we need rather than what we think we want. And for James Carter, that gift would come in the form of a young woman with nothing to her name but pride and a spirit that no amount of money could buy. But that was tomorrow's story. Tonight, there was only the whiskey, the stars, and the aching awareness that success without someone to share it with was just another form of poverty. The town of Willow Falls wasn't much to look at, a collection of weathered buildings huddled along a dusty main street like cattle seeking shelter from a storm. But for Margaret Maggie Dawson, it was the only home she'd ever known. At 19, she'd already lived through more hardship than most faced in a lifetime. Orphaned at 12 when fever took both her parents in the same terrible week. She rose before dawn, as always, her small room above the general store cold despite the approaching summer heat. Mrs. Weatherby, the store owner's wife, allowed her to stay there in exchange for long hours of work that started before the roosters crowed and ended well after decent folk had retired for the night. Margaret, Mrs. Weatherby's sharp voice carried up the stairs. "Those shelves won't stock themselves." "Coming, ma'am," Maggie called back, quickly pinning up her long chestnut hair and smoothing her faded calico dress. It was one of only 3 she owned, carefully mended and remended until the original fabric was more memory than reality. The store was already stifling. Despite the early hour, Maggie set about her tasks, sweeping the floors, arranging the goods, preparing for another day of serving the townspeople who looked through her as if she were part of the furniture. To them, she was just the Dawson girl, a charity case who should be grateful for any work at all. "Don't forget to clean those pickle barrels," Mrs. Weatherby instructed, her tone suggesting Maggie was prone to forgetting, though she never had. "And mind you don't break anything. You still owe me for that cup you dropped last month." Maggie bit her tongue. The cup had been cracked when she'd unpacked it, but arguing with Mrs. Weatherby was like trying to reason with a dust storm, futile and likely to leave you worse off than before. The morning passed in its usual blur of customers and chores. Ranchers came for supplies, their wives for fabric and notions, their children for penny candy that Maggie wasn't allowed to touch. She served them all with quiet efficiency, speaking only when spoken to, invisible in her visibility. "Heard tell James Carter's looking for a wife," gossiped Mrs. Henderson, the banker's sister, as Maggie measured out 5 yards of gingham. "Eleanor Patterson's got her cap set for him, but that man's colder than a January norther. Money can't buy everything." Her companion, Mrs. Aldridge, replied with a knowing nod. "Though Lord knows it can buy most things. Still, what woman would want to wake up next to that every morning? Man looks at you like he's calculating your worth by the pound." Maggie kept her eyes on her work, though her ears caught every word. She'd seen James Carter once or twice when he came to town, always alone, always apart. He had a presence that made the air feel charged, like the moments before a thunderstorm, handsome in a severe way. with eyes that seemed to look right through you. Speaking of marriage, Mrs. Henderson's voice dropped to a whisper that wasn't quite low enough. What's to become of the Dawson girl? Pretty enough, I suppose, but without family or dowry. She'll be lucky to find work as a domestic. Mrs. Aldridge replied, though with those looks, she'd better be careful. You know how men are with girls who have no protection. The word stung, but Maggie had heard worse. She wrapped the fabric carefully, accepted the payment, and wished the ladies a good day with a smile that never reached her eyes. By noon, the heat had become unbearable. The store was empty, the townspeople seeking shelter from the sun's assault. Mrs. Weatherby had retired for her afternoon nap, leaving Maggie to mind things alone. She stood by the window, watching dust devils dance down the empty street, and allowed herself a moment of dreaming. Somewhere beyond this town, there was a world where a girl's worth wasn't measured by her father's name or her dowry. Somewhere, there might be a place where she could be more than the orphan who swept floors and stocked shelves. You'll go blind staring at nothing. Mr. Weatherby's voice made her jump. He'd appeared behind her, too close, reeking of tobacco and whiskey despite the early hour. Just watching for customers, sir, Maggie said, stepping away. Always so dutiful, he said, his smile making her skin crawl. A man appreciates that in a woman. You know, Margaret, you're getting to an age where you should be thinking about your future. Yes, sir, she replied carefully, moving to put the counter between them. I could help with that future, he continued, following her movement. A girl like you needs protection, security. I could provide that. Maggie's stomach turned. Mr. Weatherby was 50 if he was a day, with a wife upstairs and hands that lingered too long when giving her pay. Hey, Mrs. Weatherby has been very kind to me, she said, hoping the mention of his wife would deter him. Mrs. Weatherby doesn't have to know about every kindness I might show you, he said, reaching across the counter. The bell above the door chimed, and Maggie nearly wept with relief as Tom Brennan entered, dusty from the trail. Afternoon, Tom said, his keen eyes taking in the scene. Miss Dawson, Weatherby. Mr. Weatherby retreated, muttering about inventory in the back room. Tom watched him go before turning to Maggie. You all right, miss? Yes, thank you, Maggie said, though her hands shook slightly as she straightened some already straight items on the counter. What can I help you with? Need some supplies for the Carter Ranch. Got a list here. As Maggie filled his order, Tom made idle conversation, his presence a shield against Mr. Weatherby's return. She'd always liked Tom Brennan. He was one of the few who treated her with genuine respect, not pity or worse. Hot day for riding, she said, wrapping his purchases. That it is, thinking about taking a dip in Willow Creek on the way back. That swimming hole about 3 miles south is calling my name. That sounds wonderful, Maggie said wistfully. She couldn't remember the last time she'd had a moment for such simple pleasures. You should try it sometime, Tom said kindly. Early morning or late afternoon's best. Peaceful then. Nobody around for miles. After he left, the afternoon dragged on interminably. Mr. Weatherby found excuses to hover nearby, and Mrs. Weatherby woke from her nap in a fouler mood than usual. By the time the store closed, Maggie felt like a rag that had been wrung out too many times. Don't think you're done yet, Mrs. Weatherby snapped. This place is filthy. I want every shelf dusted before you even think about supper. It was well past 8 when Maggie finally climbed the stairs to her room. Her supper was cold cornbread and the heel of yesterday's bread Mrs. Weatherby believed in economy when it came to feeding charity cases. She ate mechanically, too tired to taste, too weary to care. But as she prepared for bed, Tom Brennan's words echoed in her mind. A swimming hole, 3 miles south, early morning when nobody was around. The thought was like a cool breeze through her stifling room. When was the last time she'd done something just for herself? When had she last felt truly clean, truly free? She made her decision. Tomorrow was Saturday, Mrs. Weatherby would sleep late, and Mr. Weatherby would be at the saloon before dawn, playing cards with the other merchants. If she left early enough, she could be back before anyone noticed. That night, Maggie dreamed of cool water and endless skies, of a world where she could wash away more than just dirt and sweat. She dreamed of being clean in a way that had nothing to do with soap and everything to do with dignity. The next morning came with a pristine clarity that only the desert could produce. Maggie woke an hour before her usual time, her heart already racing with the audacity of her plan. She dressed quickly in her oldest dress, the one she wore for the dirtiest chores, and crept down the stairs like a thief. The town was still sleeping as she slipped out the back door. The air was cool, almost sweet, carrying the promise of another scorching day. But for now, in this stolen hour, the world belonged to her. She walked quickly, keeping to the shadows, then broke into a run once she reached the edge of town. It felt glorious, this simple act of movement without purpose or destination beyond her own desire. Her feet found the old trail that wound south, following the creek's meandering path. 3 miles had seemed so far when Tom mentioned it, but her eager steps ate up the distance. The landscape changed from the flat, dusty environs of town to rolling hills dotted with mesquite and oak. The creek gurgled alongside the trail, growing wider and deeper as she went. And then she sought a natural pool where the creek widened and deepened, sheltered by cottonwoods and willows that created a private paradise. The water was clear enough to see the sandy bottom, fed by a small waterfall that tumbled over smooth rocks. Maggie stood at the edge, suddenly uncertain. She'd never done anything like this before, never taken something just for herself. But the water called to her, promising relief from more than just the heat. She looked around carefully, confirming what she already knew: she was completely alone. The nearest ranch was miles away, the town hidden beyond the hills. This early, even the most industrious cowboy would still be eating breakfast. Slowly, feeling both terrified and exhilarated, she began to undress. Each piece of clothing she removed felt like shedding a weight: the expectations, the pity, the unwanted attention, the constant reminder of her place in the world. When she finally stood at the water's edge in only her chemise, she felt more vulnerable and more powerful than ever before. The first touch of water on her toes made her gasp. It was cooler than expected, but perfect in its shock. She waded in slowly, savoring each sensation. When the water reached her waist, she took a breath and ducked under completely, letting the creek wash over her like a baptism. She came up laughing, actually laughing for the first time in longer than she could remember. For this moment, she wasn't the orphan, the charity case, the girl with no prospects. She was just Maggie, young and alive and free. She floated on her back, watching clouds drift across the morning sky, feeling clean in a way that had nothing to do with soap and everything to do with claiming this small rebellion. The water held her like an embrace, cool and accepting, asking nothing of her but her presence. She swam in lazy circles, dove to touch the sandy bottom, splashed like the child she'd never really been allowed to be. Time ceased to exist in any meaningful way. There was only the water, the sky, and this perfect moment of solitude. She didn't hear the horse approaching on the trail, muffled by the sound of the waterfall. She didn't see the rider crest the hill, heading for the same sanctuary she'd claimed. She was standing in the shallows, wringing water from her long hair, when she heard it, the sharp intake of breath that wasn't her own. Her head snapped up, and there, frozen on his black stallion at the pool's edge, was James Carter. For a moment that stretched like eternity, they stared at each other. Maggie's mind went blank with shock and mortification. Water streamed from her hair, her chemise clung to her form, and she stood exposed in every possible way before the most powerful man in 3 counties. James seemed equally stunned, his usual composure shattered. His mouth opened as if to speak, but no words came. His eyes, usually so cold and calculating, were wide with an emotion she couldn't name. Reality crashed back like a physical blow. With a cry of distress, Maggie splashed toward her clothes, trying to cover herself with her hands. Her face burned with a shame so intense it felt like it might consume her. "I'm sorry." James's voice was hoarse, strange. I didn't know anyone was here." He wheeled Tempest around sharply, presenting his back to her, but the damage was done. Maggie's hands shook so badly she could barely manage her buttons. Tears of humiliation streamed down her face as she struggled into her dress, the fabric sticking to her wet skin. "Please," she whispered, though she didn't know what she was begging for. "Please don't tell anyone. Please forget this happened. Please don't let this be real." "I should go," James said, still facing away. "I apologize for the intrusion." But as he spurred Tempest forward, he couldn't help but glance back once. Their eyes met across the distance, his gray ones dark with something that looked like wonder, hers brown and swimming with tears. Then he was gone, disappearing over the hill as quickly as he'd appeared, leaving Maggie alone with her shame and the terrible certainty that her life had just become infinitely more complicated. She finished dressing with trembling fingers. Her morning of freedom transformed into a nightmare. The swim that had felt like claiming her dignity now felt like losing it entirely. She'd been truly seen by James Carter of all people. The walk back to town was the longest of her life. Every step felt like walking toward a gallows. What would he do? Would he tell someone? Would the story spread through town like wildfire, confirming everyone's worst assumptions about the Dawson girl? By the time she slipped back into the store, the sun was fully up, and her absence had gone unnoticed. But as she went about her duties, she felt marked, changed. The memory of James Carter's eyes shocked. Yes, but something else too haunted her throughout the day. She didn't know that 3 miles away. James sat in his study, staring at nothing, unable to focus on the ledgers before him. The image of her in the morning light, water-kissed and free, had burned itself into his mind like a brand. In that moment, she hadn't been a town girl or a charity case or anything but achingly, perfectly beautiful. And for the first time in his adult life, James Carter found himself completely, utterly undone by another human being. For 3 days, James Carter couldn't concentrate on anything. Ledgers went unbalanced, correspondence unanswered, and ranch business neglected. Tom Brennan watched his boss with growing concern as James stared out windows, started conversations only to trail off mid-sentence, and rode out alone at odd hours. "You feeling all right, boss?" Tom finally asked on the 4th morning. "You've been acting peculiar since Saturday." "I'm fine," James replied curtly, then softened his tone. "Just thinking about expanding operations." Tom raised an eyebrow, but said nothing. In 15 years of friendship, he'd never seen James this distracted. The truth was, James couldn't get Margaret Dawson out of his mind. The image of her in that pool, natural and unguarded, had shattered something inside him. He'd seen beautiful women before at cattle auctions in Fort Worth, in the saloons of Dodge City, but none had affected him like this slip of a girl with nothing to her name. He knew who she was, of course. In a town the size of Willow Falls, everyone knew everyone. The orphan Dawson girl who worked at Weatherby's store. Pretty enough to draw notice, but too poor to matter. He'd barely registered her existence before. Just another face in town. Now he couldn't stop thinking about her. On Thursday morning, James made a decision. He rode into town on legitimate business. The ranch did need supplies, but his true purpose was something he couldn't quite admit even to himself. The main street was busy with the usual traffic of wagons and horses. James tied Tempest outside the general store, his heart beating faster than it had any right to. Through the window, he could see her behind the counter, helping Mrs. Henderson with fabric. He entered, the bell announcing his arrival with a cheerful chime that felt too loud. Maggie looked up, and their eyes met. The color drained from her face, then rushed back in a wave of crimson. She dropped the fabric she was holding. "Clumsy girl! Mrs.!" Weatherby scolded, appearing from behind a shelf. "Oh, Mr. Carter. What an honor. How can we help you today?" "Supplies," James said, his voice rougher than intended. He pulled out a list, carefully avoiding looking at Maggie, who was gathering the fallen fabric with shaking hands. Of course, Margaret. Stop fumbling with that and help Mr. Carter. Best service for our best customers." Maggie approached slowly, like a deer approaching a hunter. What can I get for you?" "Mr. Carter." He handed her the list, their fingers brushing briefly. She jerked back as if burned, and he felt the touch like a brand on his skin. "I'll get these right away," she whispered, fleeing to fill the order. James watched her move through the store, noting the grace in her movements despite her obvious distress. She was beautiful, he realized with a start. How had he never noticed before? "Fine girl, our Margaret." Mr. Weatherby appeared at his elbow, his tone oily. "Hard worker, grateful for the position, you understand. Very accommodating." Something in the man's tone made James's jaw clench. "She seems competent," he said coldly. "Oh, more than competent." Weatherby continued with a wink that made James want to hit him. "A man in your position must get lonely. If you ever need companionship, I'm sure arrangements could be made." "What exactly are you suggesting?" James's voice was dangerously quiet. Weatherby, too stupid to recognize the threat, plowed on. "Just that a wealthy man has needs, and a poor girl has necessities. It's the way of the world." "Get out," James said. "I beg your pardon." "Get out of your own store before I throw you through that window." Weatherby paled, finally recognizing the fury in James's eyes. He scuttled to the back room like the rodent he was. Maggie returned with an armload of goods, stopping short at the tension in the air. Is everything all right?" "Fine," James said, his anger melting at the sight of her. "I apologize for the other day." She glanced around nervously. "Please, can we not—" "Of course." He paused, then added quietly, "You have nothing to be ashamed of." Her eyes filled with tears she refused to let fall. "Easy for you to say. You're not—" She stopped herself. "Not what?" "Not nobody," she whispered. Before he could respond, she'd totaled his purchases with quick efficiency. He paid, wanting to say more but aware of Mrs. Weatherby watching from the doorway. As he loaded his horse, James made another decision. Returning to the store, he found Mrs. Weatherby alone at the counter. "I need a shop girl at the ranch," he said without preamble. "Someone to manage household supplies. Organize shipments. I'll pay twice what you're paying Miss Dawson." Mrs. Weatherby's eyes gleamed with avarice. "Well, I don't know. She's valuable to us here." "3 times, James said flatly. "Sold, Mrs. Weatherby said quickly. "When would you like her to start?" "Monday. I'll send a wagon." He left before Maggie returned, before he could see her reaction to this change in her circumstances. It wasn't until he was halfway home that he realized what he'd done. He'd just complicated his life enormously, bringing her into his sphere when he should be keeping distance. The news spread through Willow Falls like wildfire. By evening, everyone knew that James Carter had hired the Dawson girl, and speculation ran wild. "Mark my words, that girl's got her hooks in him," Eleanor Patterson said bitterly at the church sewing circle. "First, she parades around like a saloon girl, and now this." "What do you mean, parades around?" asked Mrs. Aldridge eagerly. Eleanor leaned in conspiratorially. "My cousin saw her heading out of town before dawn on Saturday, coming back with wet hair and a guilty look. Now, suddenly James Carter's offering her employment. It doesn't take a scholar to figure that sum." The poison spread quickly. By the time Maggie heard about the job offer from a gleeful Mrs. Weatherby, half the town was convinced she'd seduced James Carter. "You start Monday," Mrs. Weatherby informed her that evening. "And don't think this changes anything. You're still the same charity case, just with a richer benefactor, though what he sees in you." She shook her head. "Must have been quite a performance at that swimming hole." Maggie's blood turned to ice. "How did you—" "Oh, child." Mrs. Weatherby laughed nastily. "Did you think you could keep secrets in this town? Amos Blake saw you heading that way. And now, mister, Carter's interest confirms what you were up to." "It wasn't like that," Maggie protested. "He came upon me by accident." "Of course he did." Mrs. Weatherby's smile was vicious. "Just remember, what goes up must come down. When he tires of you, and he don't come crying back here." Maggie fled to her room, tears finally falling. She'd wanted to escape the store, but not like this. Not with everyone thinking she was James Carter's mistress. The next day was torture. Everywhere she went, conversations stopped. Men looked at her with new interest. Women with open contempt. At church on Sunday, the minister's wife pointedly moved when Maggie sat near her. Only Tom Brennan treated her normally when he came to collect her Monday morning. "Don't mind the gossips, miss," he said kindly as he loaded her few possessions. "They've got nothing better to do than flap their gums." "They're saying terrible things," Maggie said quietly. "They said terrible things about Mr. Carter when he first got rich, too. Said he must have made a deal with the devil. People hate seeing others rise above their station." The ranch was even more impressive up close. The main house rose like a palace from the prairie, all limestone and glass. Ranch hands stopped work to stare as the wagon rolled past. "You'll have a room in the main house," Tom explained. "Mr. Carter wants you to manage household accounts, oversee supply orders, coordinate with the cook and housekeeper. Rosa will show you around." Rosa, the Mexican housekeeper, was a small woman with kind eyes who took Maggie under her wing immediately. "You don't listen to those men," she said, gesturing at the staring ranch hands. "Mr. James, he is a good man, lonely, but good." The house was even grander inside than out. Maggie's room, larger than the entire space she'd shared above the store, had real glass windows and a bed with an actual mattress, not just a straw tick. "Mr. James says you eat with the family," Rosa continued, which meant eating with James since there was no other family. "Breakfast at 6, dinner at 7. Maggie's stomach nodded at the thought, but she nodded. She spent the day learning the house's routines, grateful to have work to occupy her mind. But as evening approached, dread built in her chest. How could she face him across a dinner table after what had happened? When Rosa rang the dinner bell, Maggie considered pleading illness, but that would be cowardice, and she'd been accused of enough already. James was already seated when she entered the dining room. He rose politely, a gesture that surprised her. No one had ever stood for her before. "Miss Dawson, I hope you're settling in well." "Yes, thank you," she managed, taking the seat Rosa indicated. The table could have seated 20, but was set for 2, the distance between them feeling both too great and not great enough. James seemed as uncomfortable as she was, focusing intently on his soup. "I want to be clear," he said suddenly, "about your position here. You're an employee, nothing more or less. Whatever the town gossips are saying—" "I know what they're saying," Maggie interrupted, surprising herself with her boldness. "They're saying I'm your—" She couldn't finish. "You're not," he said firmly. "You're here to work, and anyone who suggests otherwise will answer to me." That won't stop the talk. "No," he agreed. "But the truth has a way of outlasting lies." They ate in silence for a while before he spoke again. "Why were you at the creek that morning?" Maggie considered how to answer. "I wanted to feel clean," she said finally. "Not just from dirt, but from everything. The pity, the suggestions, the hands that linger too long when giving out pay. She looked up at him. I wanted one moment where I could just be myself. Not the Dawson girl or the charity case or the future domestic, just me. James stared at her, something shifting in his gray eyes. I understand that feeling. Do you? When have you ever been anything but James Carter, richest man in 3 counties? When I was Jimmy Carter, eldest of 6, watching my father drink himself to death and my mother take in washing to keep us from starving, he said quietly. When I was just another trail hand, fighting for every dollar. When I realized that no amount of money could make people see me as anything but the poor farm boy who got above himself. Maggie blinked, seeing him differently. I didn't know. Not many do. I've worked hard to bury that boy. He paused. Maybe too hard. The confession hung between them, creating an unexpected intimacy. For the first time, Maggie saw past the stern exterior to the man beneath one who knew about being looked down upon, about hunger that went deeper than empty bellies. I'm sorry, she said softly, for judging you. And I'm sorry for, that morning. You deserve that moment of freedom. Their eyes met and held, something electric passing between them. Then James cleared his throat, breaking the spell. Rosa will show you the account books tomorrow. I'll be away for a few days on business. He was retreating, she realized, pulling back behind his walls. But she'd seen behind them now, and that changed everything. As she prepared for bed that night in her new room, Maggie reflected on the strange turns her life had taken. A week ago, she'd been invisible. Now she was the center of a scandal, working for a man who was far more complex than anyone knew. Outside, she could hear the ranch settling for the night horses nickering, cowboys calling to each other, the wind sighing through the grass. It was a lonely sound, but somehow less lonely than the silence above the store had been. Meanwhile, in his study, James stared at ledgers without seeing them. He'd hired her out of guilt, he told himself, and perhaps a desire to protect her from men like Weatherby. But sitting across from her at dinner, watching her face in the lamplight, hearing her speak with such raw honesty, he was in trouble, deep trouble, because Margaret Dawson wasn't just beautiful or desperate or available. As the gossip suggested, she was real in a way that no one in his life had been for years. And that reality, that authenticity, called to something in him he'd thought money and success had killed. But he was James Carter, and she was the Dawson girl, and the chasm between them was wider than the Rio Grande. Whatever he was feeling had to be crushed before it could take root. He didn't yet know that some feelings, like some people, refuse to be crushed. They grow in the harshest conditions, finding water in stone, light in darkness. And sometimes, the very things we think divide us become the bridges that connect us. The die was cast, the scandal was born, and 2 lonely people had taken the first steps toward each other, even as the world conspired to keep them apart. 3 weeks passed in a delicate dance of proximity and distance. James had returned from his business trip to find his household running more smoothly than it had in years. Maggie had proven herself invaluable organizing accounts with meticulous care, managing supplies with an efficiency that saved money, and bringing a quiet warmth to the cold mansion. They developed a routine of careful cordiality, breakfast together before the day's work began, dinner when his business allowed, always with Rosa hovering nearby like a benevolent guardian. They spoke of safe things, ranch business, weather, the books in his library that she'd shyly asked to borrow. But underneath the polite exchanges, something else simmered. James found himself listening for her footsteps in the hall, watching for the way she tucked an errant strand of hair behind her ear when concentrating on ledgers. Maggie discovered she could predict his moods by the set of his shoulders, knew he took his coffee black with 1 sugar when troubled, none when content. The storm came on a Thursday evening in late June. The day had been oppressively hot, the air thick as molasses and twice as heavy. By afternoon, thunderheads built on the horizon like mountains of black cotton. promising the kind of storm that turned dry washes into rivers and sent cattle running wild. "Gonna be a big one," Tom observed, helping the hand secure anything that might blow away. "Haven't seen clouds like that since '71. James had been in the north pasture when the weather turned. Checking on the pregnant heifers, they'd moved closer to the ranch. By the time he started back, the wind had picked up to a howl, sending dust devils spinning across the range. Maggie stood on the porch, watching the approaching storm with a mixture of awe and anxiety. She'd lived through plenty of Texas storms, but something about this one felt different, angrier, more primal. "Miss Maggie," Rosa called from inside. "Better come in. This storm, it means business." But she lingered, watching the first fat raindrops splatter in the dust. Lightning split the sky, illuminating the landscape in stark relief. In that brief, white moment, she saw a lone rider racing toward the ranch, bent low over his horse's neck. "James!" Without thinking, she ran down the steps into the rising storm. The wind nearly knocked her over, and within seconds, she was soaked through. But she could see him clearly now, Tempest running flat out with his ears pinned back. They thundered into the yard just as the sky opened completely. James swung down from the saddle, shouting something lost in the wind. A ranch hand appeared to take Tempest, and James grabbed Maggie's arm, pulling her toward the house. They burst through the door together, dripping and breathless. The sudden quiet of the house after the roar outside was almost shocking. "What were you thinking?" James demanded, water streaming from his hair. "You could have been struck by lightning." "I saw you riding in," Maggie gasped, shivering now in her soaked dress. I don't know what I thought." They stood in the entry hall, staring at each other. Maggie became acutely aware of how her wet dress clung to her, of the way James's shirt outlined every muscle. His eyes darkened as he looked at her, and she saw the moment he remembered another time he'd seen her soaked with water. "You're shaking," he said, his voice rough. "You need to get warm." Rosa appeared with towels and stern words about catching their death. She ushered Maggie upstairs while James headed to his own rooms to change. But the storm had other plans. The wind rose to a scream, and suddenly there was a tremendous crash from somewhere above. The house shuddered. "The north window," Rosa cried. "In the empty wing." James took the stairs 3 at a time, Maggie following despite Rosa's protests. They found chaos. A massive oak branch had smashed through a window, rain pouring in like a waterfall. Wind howled through the broken glass, threatening to tear the room apart. "Help me with this," James shouted over the storm, grabbing one end of a heavy wardrobe. Together they wrestled it across the window, partially blocking the opening. But it wasn't enough. The wind kept finding ways through. "The linens," Maggie pointed to a chest in the corner. They grabbed armfuls of old sheets and quilts, stuffing them into gaps, working together with an efficiency born of necessity. Lightning struck too close, the thunder following instantly. The lights flickered and died, plunging them into darkness save for the intermittent flashes from outside. James found her hand in the dark. "Come on, nothing more we can do here." They felt their way down the hallway, James leading with the confidence of someone who knew every inch of his home. He pulled her into his study and shut the door against the chaos. "There are oil lamps in the desk," he said, releasing her hand reluctantly. She heard him fumbling in the dark. Then the scratch of a match. Warm light bloomed. Pushing back the shadows, he lit 2 more lamps, creating a circle of golden safety while the storm raged outside. They were both soaked through, shivering. James went to a cabinet and pulled out a bottle of whiskey and 2 glasses. "This'll warm us up," he said, pouring generous measures. "Rosa will have my hide for giving you spirits, but—" "Rosa's probably hiding in her room praying," Maggie said, accepting the glass gratefully. The whiskey burned, but it did chase away some of the chill. They stood awkwardly, dripping on his expensive rug. James grabbed a throw from the settee and wrapped it around her shoulders. his hands lingering perhaps a moment too long. "You're still shaking," he observed. "It's not just the cold," she admitted. Another lightning strike, another boom of thunder that seemed to shake the foundations. Without thinking, she moved closer to him. He didn't step away. "Are you afraid of storms?" he asked softly. "Not usually. But this one?" She looked up at him. "My parents died during a storm like this. Not the storm itself, but the fever that came after, from the flooding." His arm came around her shoulders, pulling her against his warmth. It should have felt improper, scandalous. Instead, it felt like coming home. "I'm sorry," he murmured into her hair. "I didn't know." "How could you? I'm just the Dawson girl, the charity case who should be grateful." "Stop!" His voice was fierce. "You're not just anything. You're... She pulled back to look at him, seeing her own feelings reflected in his eyes. The careful distance they'd maintained for 3 weeks crumbled like walls before floodwater. "James," she whispered. He cupped her face in his hands, thumbs brushing away raindrops or tears, she wasn't sure which. "I've tried to stay away, tried to keep things proper, but God help me, Maggie, I can't stop thinking about you. The whole town already thinks we're..." She couldn't finish. "I don't give a damn what the town thinks." His voice was raw with emotion. "Do you..." Thunder crashed overhead, and she made her choice, rising on her toes. She pressed her lips to his. The kiss was desperate, hungry. 3 weeks of suppressed longing released in an instant. His arms came around her, crushing her against him. And she didn't care that they were both soaked, that this was madness, that everything about it was wrong by society's standards. It was right. It was the only thing that had felt right in so very long. When they finally broke apart, both breathing heavily, the world had shifted on its axis. "Maggie." He said her name like a prayer. I should... "Don't," she said, placing a finger against his lips. "Don't apologize. Don't pull away. Just hold me through this storm." He gathered her close again, and they sank onto the settee together. She curled into his warmth while the storm battered the house, safe in the circle of lamplight and his arms. "This changes everything," he said quietly. "I know. It won't be easy, the talk, the judgment. It's already not easy," she pointed out. "At least now there would be truth behind their gossip." He pressed a kiss to her forehead. "You deserve better than scandal." "I deserve to choose," she said firmly. "And I choose you." The storm raged for hours, but they barely noticed. They really talked, sharing stories of their past, their dreams, their fears. James told her about the younger siblings he'd lost touch with, scattered across the country. Maggie spoke of her parents, of the dreams she'd buried when they died. "I wanted to be a teacher," she confessed. "I love children, love seeing them learn, but without money for normal school." "You could teach here?" James said suddenly. "The ranch children. Most can't read or write." "You'd let me..." "I'd be proud to have you do it." He hesitated, then added, "This place needs more than just cattle and ledgers. It needs life. You've brought that..." The storm began to ease as dawn approached. The wind died to a whisper. The rain softened to a patter. They dozed on the settee, wrapped in each other and the throw. Propriety abandoned in favor of warmth and comfort. Maggie woke first, momentarily disoriented. Then memory flooded back the storm. The kiss, the hours spent in James's arms. She should feel ashamed. Instead, she felt complete. James stirred, his eyes opening slowly. For a moment, vulnerability showed clear on his face before his usual control reasserted itself. "The storm's passed?" she said softly. "Yes," but he made no move to release her. "Maggie, what happened last night was the most honest thing that's happened since I came here." She finished. "Don't you dare regret it. A smile, a real smile, transformed his face. Regret holding you, never. But we need to be careful. There are those who would use this against us both. Like Amos Blake. James's expression darkened. You know about his interest. Every woman in town knows to avoid Amos Blake's interest. She shuddered slightly. He's been worse since you hired me. Says things when he sees me in town. What kind of things? James's voice had gone dangerously quiet. Nothing worth repeating. Just making it clear he believes the gossip and thinks that makes me available to anyone with money. James's arms tightened around her. I'll have a word with Mr. Blake. No, don't. It'll only make things worse. Then what do you suggest? She was quiet for a moment, then said, Make it clear I'm under your protection, not as your mistress, but as someone you value, someone who matters. You do matter, he said fiercely. More than you know. A knock at the door made them spring apart. Mr. James. Rosa's worried voice came through. Miss Maggie, are you all right? We're fine. Rosa, James called back. We were securing the north wing when the lights went out. We waited here for the storm to pass. If Rosa suspected more. She gave no sign when they emerged, properly distanced once again, but there was a knowing look in her eyes as she bustled Maggie off to change into dry clothes. The storm had left damage in its wake, broken windows, downed trees, scattered debris, but as the ranch hands worked to clean up, there was a sense that something had been cleared away, some obstacle removed. At breakfast, James and Maggie maintained proper distance, but their eyes met often, carrying silent conversations. The carefully constructed walls between them had fallen, and there was no rebuilding them. That evening, as Maggie worked on the household accounts, she found a note tucked between the pages. Meet me at the creek tonight after dinner, where it all began. J. Her heart raced as she read it. This was dangerous, foolish. If anyone saw... But hadn't she already made her choice? Hadn't she decided that some things were worth the risk? As the sun set over the storm-washed land, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold, Maggie knew that everything had indeed changed. The storm had broken more than windows. It had broken down the last barriers between two lonely souls. Whatever came next, scandal, judgment, Amos Blake's threats, they would face it together. The storm had passed, but its aftermath would reshape the landscape of their lives in ways neither could yet imagine. Word traveled faster than wildfire in drought season. By noon the next day, everyone in Willow Falls knew about the storm damage at the Carter Ranch, and more importantly, that James Carter and the Dawson girl had spent the night alone together while the storm raged. The story grew with each telling. By the time it reached the church sewing circle, Maggie had been seen in nothing but her nightgown, and James had dismissed all the servants to ensure privacy. The fact that Rosa herself contradicted these embellishments mattered little. People believed what they wanted to believe. I always knew that girl was trouble, Eleanor Patterson announced to anyone who would listen, throwing herself at poor Mr. Carter the moment she got the chance. He's a man, after all, and men have weaknesses. At Weatherby's store, the gossip was even more vicious. Called it from the start. Mr. Weatherby told his customers with satisfaction, girl like that, no family, no morals, what else could you expect? But it was Amos Blake who saw opportunity in the scandal. The saloon owner had watched Maggie for months, his interest growing when she'd repeatedly refused his advances. Now, with her reputation in tatters, he figured she'd have no choice but to accept the protection of whoever offered it. Shame about the Dawson girl, he said loudly in his saloon that evening. Carter's had his fun, but he won't marry her. Men like him don't marry their entertainment. When he's done, she'll need somewhere to go. The words reached Tom Brennan within hours. The foreman's face was grim when he found James in the barn the next morning. Boss, we need to talk. James looked up from examining Tempest's hoof. If it's about the west fence. I already told Miguel. It's about Miss Maggie. James straightened slowly. What about her? Tom related what he'd heard, watching his friend's face darken with each word. It's getting ugly. Jim, real ugly. The hands are starting to talk too. Fire anyone who speaks disrespectfully about her. Can't fire the whole town. Tom hesitated, then added, maybe it would be better if she went back to town for a while. Let things calm down. She's not going anywhere, James said flatly. Then you need to do something. Either make your intentions clear or what? James's voice was dangerous. Let her face those wolves alone. You heard what Blake said. I'm just saying, this halfway situation isn't fair to her. The protection you're offering isn't enough if people think she's just your... Don't, James cut him off. Don't say it. Tom sighed. Jim, I've known you 15 years. I've never seen you look at anyone the way you look at her. But if you care about her, really care, then you need to think about what's best for her, not just what you want. After Tom left, James stood in the barn, fists clenched. He knew Tom was right. The situation was becoming untenable, but the thought of Maggie leaving, of losing the light she'd brought to his life. Meanwhile, Maggie was facing her own trials. She'd gone to town for supplies, refusing to hide despite Rosa's worried protests. The moment she entered the main street, she felt the weight of every stare, heard every whisper cut short. At the general store, Mrs. Weatherby greeted her with false sweetness. Why, Margaret, how brave of you to show your face, though I suppose when you've lost everything else. What's a little public humiliation? Maggie held her head high. I've lost nothing that matters. Haven't you your reputation, your future, any chance of a respectable marriage, though I suppose you weren't aiming for respectable? Other customers gathered, drawn by the spectacle. Maggie felt like she was in a pillory, displayed for public judgment. She always did think she was too good for honest work, someone muttered. Poor Mr. Carter, taken in by a scheming... That's enough! The voice cut through the crowd like a blade. Everyone turned to see James standing in the doorway, his presence filling the space. He walked directly to Maggie's side, his hand settling possessively on her elbow. Miss Dawson is conducting business for the Carter Ranch, he said, his voice carrying clear authority. Anyone who has a problem with that can take it up with me. Anyone who speaks disrespectfully about her will answer to me. Is that understood? The crowd dispersed like smoke, suddenly finding urgent business elsewhere. Mrs. Weatherby retreated behind her counter, face flushed. You didn't have to do that, Maggie whispered as they left. Yes, I did. He helped her onto the wagon seat, then surprised everyone by climbing up beside her instead of mounting Tempest. And it's not enough. They rode in silence until they were out of town. Then James pulled the wagon to a stop under a cottonwood tree. This has to end, he said. Maggie's heart plummeted. I understand. I'll pack my things. What? No. He turned to face her fully. That's not what I meant. I mean this situation, the gossip, the disrespect. It has to end. How? He took her hands in his, calloused thumbs stroking over her knuckles. Marry me. The world seemed to stop. What? Marry me, he repeated, more firmly. Not because of the gossip or to save your reputation. Because I can't imagine my life without you. Because you've made me remember who I was before money and success froze my heart. Because I love you. Tears filled her eyes. James, I know it's not the proposal you deserve. You should have flowers and candlelight and pretty words. But I'm not good with pretty words. All I can offer is the truth I love you, and I'll spend my life trying to be worthy of you. You fool, she said through her tears. You've always been worthy. But James, think about what you're saying. The scandal. We'll die when you're Mrs. Carter. Oh, they'll gossip for a while. But legitimacy has a way of silencing wagging tongues. And if it doesn't, then we'll face it together. He cupped her face gently. I'm not naive. Maggie, I know there will be those who never accept you, who'll always see you as beneath me. But they're wrong. You're above me in every way that matters. I'm nobody. You're everything, he corrected fiercely. Say yes. She searched his face, seeing the vulnerability he showed to no one else. The ranch, your business associates, can all go to hell if they can't accept my wife. Your wife, she repeated wonderingly. Then, with growing certainty, yes, I'll marry you. He kissed her there on the main road, in full view of anyone who might pass. It was a declaration as clear as any announcement. When they returned to the ranch, the news spread quickly. Some of the hands grinned and congratulated them. Others looked skeptical, but all knew better than to voice any negative opinions in James's hearing. That evening, Amos Blake arrived at the ranch uninvited. James met him on the porch, keeping him from entering the house. Heard the news, Blake said, his smile cold. Congratulations, though I wonder if you've thought this through. My thoughts are my own business. Perhaps, but actions have consequences. Blake's voice dropped. That little filly you're so taken with sure would be a shame if something happened to her. The road between here and town can be dangerous for a woman alone. James moved so fast Blake didn't see it coming. One moment, he was standing. The next, he was on his back in the dirt, James's boot on his throat. Listen carefully, James said, his voice deadly calm. If you look at my fiancée, if you speak to her, if you come within 50 feet of her, I'll kill you. That's not a threat, it's a promise. And unlike you, I keep my promises. Blake wheezed, clawing at the boot. James let him up, watching dispassionately as he scrambled to his feet. You've made an enemy today, Carter, Blake spat, backing toward his horse. I made an enemy the day you set eyes on her. Today I'm just making it official. After Blake fled, James found Maggie in the garden, tending roses Rosa had planted years ago. She looked up at his approach, concern creasing her brow. I heard raised voices. Amos Blake won't be bothering you anymore. She studied his face. What did you do? What needed doing? He pulled her close. I protect what's mine. I'm not a possession, James. No, he agreed. You're my heart, and a man has a right to defend his heart. The next few days were a whirlwind. James insisted on a quick wedding. I won't give them more time to gossip, and threw his considerable resources into the preparations. A dress was ordered from Fort Worth. The church was secured, and Judge Morrison agreed to officiate. But the opposition was organizing too. Eleanor Patterson led a delegation of concerned citizens to the minister, arguing that the marriage was improper, possibly illegal, certainly immoral. The girl has bewitched him, Eleanor insisted. It's our Christian duty to save him from this mistake. Reverend Thompson, a mild man who disliked conflict, found himself caught between the town's moral guardians and its richest citizen. He compromised by suggesting a month's delay for proper reflection and preparation. James's response was immediate. He sent for Judge Morrison, who had the legal authority to perform marriages, and moved the ceremony to the ranch. Let them come onto my land to object, he said grimly. But Maggie was struggling. The weight of disapproval, the whispers, the predictions of doom had all pressed down on her. The night before the wedding, she stood at her window, watching the stars. Having second thoughts, she turned to find James in her doorway. You shouldn't be here. It's bad luck. We've already had our share of that. He entered, closing the door behind him. Talk to me. What if they're right? She whispered. What if I'm ruining you? The only ruin I face is losing you. He gathered her into his arms. Maggie, I've spent 10 years building walls around myself, becoming someone I don't even recognize. You've torn them all down. If that's ruin, I welcome it. But your reputation, your business, will survive or they won't. Either way. I'll have you." He tilted her chin up. "That's all that matters." She kissed him then, pouring all her love and fear and hope into it. When they parted, both were breathless. "Tomorrow," he said, "tomorrow you become my wife, and let the devil himself try to stop us." But the devil, as it turned out, had local representatives. As dawn broke on the wedding day, smoke was spotted rising from the east pasture. Someone had set fire to the grazing land, and all hands were needed to fight it. "It's Blake," Tom said grimly. "Has to be. Trying to disrupt the wedding?" James's face was stone. "Then he'll fail, Tom. Take every available man. Save what you can. The wedding goes on as scheduled." "But Jim..." "That's an order." As the ranch hands rode out, Maggie appeared in her wedding dress, a simple but elegant creation in ivory silk. "James, we should postpone." "No, that's what they want. We marry today. Fire or no fire." And so, as smoke darkened the eastern sky, Margaret Dawson and James Carter stood before Judge Morrison in the garden. The household staff served as witnesses, Rosa weeping openly, the stable boys grinning, even crusty Tom Brennan looking suspiciously bright-eyed. "Do you take this woman?" Judge Morrison asked. "I do," James said, his voice carrying over the distant sounds of firefighting. "Do you take this man?" "I do," Maggie said firmly, her eyes never leaving James's face. "Then, by the power vested in me by the state of Texas, I pronounce you husband and wife." Their kiss was interrupted by a cheer from the watching staff. For a moment, the troubles fell away, and there was only joy. But the smoke still rose in the east, a reminder that their battles were far from over. They'd won this skirmish, but the war for acceptance, for peace, for their right to love each other that would continue. "No regrets?" James asked as they watched the smoke. "None," Maggie replied, her new wedding ring catching the light. "Let them come. We'll face them together." And together they would, though neither yet knew how high the cost would climb before they found their peace. The fire had destroyed 30 acres of prime grazing land, but James counted it a small price for marrying Maggie. For 2 weeks after the wedding, they lived in a bubble of happiness, ignoring the outside world. James had never been one for displays of affection, but now he couldn't seem to stop touching his wife, a hand on her waist as they passed in the hall, fingers brushing as she handed him coffee, stolen kisses when they thought no one was watching. "You're making the hands nervous," Tom observed one morning, catching James smiling at nothing. "They don't know what to make of you being happy." "Let them wonder," James replied, his good mood unshakable. But the outside world wouldn't be ignored forever. The first sign of real trouble came when several business associates canceled long-standing contracts. No explanation was given, but James knew the reason association with him now carried the taint of scandal. "Henley's pulled out of the cattle drive," he told Maggie over dinner, "and Morrison won't honor our grain agreement." "Because of me," she said quietly. "Because they're cowards." He reached across the table to take her hand. "We'll find other buyers." But it wasn't that simple. Amos Blake had been busy, spreading poison throughout the county. He'd allied himself with Eleanor Patterson and others who felt James had betrayed his class by marrying beneath him. Together, they formed an unofficial boycott. Anyone who did business with the Carter Ranch risked social ostracism. The situation exploded on a sweltering July afternoon. Maggie had started teaching the ranch children, just as James had suggested. A small schoolroom had been set up in one of the outbuildings, and every morning, a dozen children gathered to learn their letters. She was in the middle of a geography lesson when she heard the thunder of hooves. Through the window, she saw a group of riders approaching 15 or 20 men, led by Amos Blake. "Children, go out the back door," she said calmly, though her heart raced. "Run to the main house and find Rosa." The children, sensing danger, obeyed quickly. Maggie stepped onto the porch just as the riders pulled up in a cloud of dust. Mrs. Carter, Blake said, his voice mocking the title. Heard you were playing schoolmarm, teaching those brats to read above their station, just like you married above yours. State your business, Mr. Blake, or leave. You're not welcome here. Not welcome, Blake laughed, and his companions joined in. That's rich, coming from a woman who wasn't welcome in decent society until she spread her legs for the richest man in... The shot cut him off mid-sentence. James stood at the corner of the building, rifle in hand, the barrel still smoking from the warning shot. The next one won't miss. James said conversationally, You've got 10 seconds to get off my land. You can't shoot us all, Carter, Blake sneered, but his bravado was shaken. No, but I can shoot you. James's voice was deadly calm. And Tom here can get another 3 or 4 before you clear leather. Want to bet your life on those odds? Tom Brennan had appeared with several armed ranch hands, all looking eager for a fight. The mathematics of violence suddenly favored the defenders. Blake's group began to shift nervously. They'd come expecting to intimidate a woman alone, not face armed resistance. This isn't over, Blake spat. You think you're untouchable, but you're wrong. We'll burn you out, destroy everything you've built. And when you've got nothing left, she'll show her true colors and leave you for the next rich fool. Get out! Each word was a bullet. Blake wheeled his horse around, his men following. But as they rode away, one threw a torch toward the schoolhouse. Tom shot it out of the air. But the message was clear next time. They might not miss. That night, James posted guards around the ranch. He found Maggie in their bedroom, staring out at the darkness. I'm sorry, she said without turning. This is all my fault. Don't. He pulled her back against his chest. Don't let them make you believe that. But it's true. If you'd married Eleanor or someone suitable, I'd be miserable. He turned her to face him. Maggie, listen to me. My whole life, I've done what was expected, what was profitable, what was safe. Marrying you is the first purely selfish thing I've ever done. And I'd do it again tomorrow. Even if it costs you everything, everything but you is negotiable. A week later, the violence escalated. Tom was ambushed on the road to town, beaten badly, though he managed to fight his way free. 2 ranch hands quit, frightened by threats against their families. Someone poisoned the well at the north pasture, killing a dozen cattle. We should go to the sheriff, Maggie urged. James laughed bitterly. Sheriff Daniels is Blake's cousin. There's no law here but what we make ourselves. The breaking point came when Rosa's nephew, Miguel, was grabbed outside the general store. He was just 15, a good kid who helped with the horses. They beat him senseless and left him with a message carved into his back, Carter whore. James went cold when he saw it, not hot with rage, but cold with the kind of fury that planned and calculated and destroyed. Pack what you need for a week, he told Maggie that night. You're going to stay with Tom's sister in Austin. I'm not leaving you. This isn't a discussion. No, it's not. She faced him squarely. I'm your wife, not your property. My place is here. Your place is where I say it is. The words hung between them like a slap. Maggie's eyes filled with tears, but her chin stayed high. Is that what I am to you, another possession to be ordered around? That's not. James ran his hands through his hair. Maggie, please. They hurt Miguel because of us, because of me. I can't let them hurt you, and I can't let you face them alone. She moved to him, taking his face in her hands. We're stronger together. Don't let them divide us, that's what they want. He pulled her close, burying his face in her hair. I can't lose you. You won't, but James, we can't live like this, under siege, waiting for the next attack. We have to take the fight to them. What do you mean? She pulled back, a determined light in her eyes. Blake's power comes from fear and intimidation, but he's not invincible. He has weaknesses, such as he owes money all over town. His saloon barely breaks even because he drinks most of the profits, and there are rumors about where he got the money to buy it in the first place. James stared at his wife with new appreciation. How do you know all this? Women talk while they're shopping. Servants talk while they're working. People forget I spent 7 years listening in that store. She smiled grimly. I know where half the bodies in this town are buried. Over the next few days, they planned carefully. James used his remaining business connections to call in debts Blake owed. Tom, despite his injuries, rallied the loyal ranch hands. And Maggie did something unexpected. She wrote letters. Who are you writing to? James asked, finding her at the desk late one night. Your brothers and sisters. He froze. What? You told me about them. Where they went, what they're doing now. Did you think I'd forget? She sealed another envelope. Robert in California, Sarah in Denver, William in Chicago. All successful now, all owing their start to their big brother who sent money when he could spare it. Maggie, they have their own lives. And you're their family. They should know what's happening. They can't help from so far away. Can't they? She smiled mysteriously. We'll see. The confrontation came sooner than expected. 3 nights later, Blake and 30 men surrounded the ranch house. They had torches, guns, and the ugly energy of a mob. Carter, Blake shouted, send out your whore, and we'll let you leave with your life. James appeared on the porch, rifle in hand. The only one leaving is you, Blake. Dead or alive, your choice. Look around you. Carter, you're outnumbered 10-1. Am I? At James's signal, lamps flared to life all around the ranch. Armed men stepped into view, not just the ranch hands, but faces Blake didn't recognize. Dozens of them. Funny thing about threatening a man's family, James called out. Sometimes that family shows up. Robert Carter stepped into the light, older and harder than when he'd left Texas, but unmistakably James's brother. Beside him stood William, and behind them, men they'd brought miners from California, railroad workers from Chicago, hard men who owed the Carter brothers favors. Hello, Amos, Robert said pleasantly. Heard you've been bothering my sister-in-law. The odds had shifted dramatically. Blake's mob, mostly townsmen playing at violence, faced real fighters who'd survived mining camps and railroad wars. This isn't your fight. Blake tried. Family is always my fight, Robert replied. Now, my brother gave you a choice. I'd take it if I were you. But Blake, drunk on his own power and possibly just drunk, made a fatal error. He pulled his gun. The night erupted in gunfire, but it was brief. Blake's men, seeing him fall, scattered like rabbits. In moments, it was over. Blake lay in the dirt, clutching his shoulder where James's bullet had found him. Should have killed him, Tom muttered. No, Maggie said, stepping onto the porch. Death would make him a martyr. This is better. She was right. With Blake wounded and his support scattered, the truth began emerging. The sheriff, forced to actually investigate, discovered that Blake had embezzled money from several investors. The saloon had been purchased with stolen funds. Within a week, Blake was in jail awaiting trial, and his allies were distancing themselves from the scandal. You did this, James told Maggie as they watched Blake being transported to the county seat. You brought my family back. You found his weaknesses. You won this war. We won it, she corrected. Together. Eleanor Patterson left town quietly, her reputation ruined by association with Blake. The Weatherbys, faced with boycotts of their own for their treatment of Maggie, sold the store and moved east, one by one. Those who'd persecuted the Carters faced consequences. But Maggie took no joy in their downfall. I just wanted to be left in peace, she said one evening as she and James walked by the creek where it all began. And now I want more. She placed his hand on her still flat belly. I want our child to grow up in a town that judges people by their character, not their birth. I want to build something better. James stopped walking, staring at her. Our child. Surprise, she said softly. He swept her into his arms, spinning her around as she laughed. When he set her down, his eyes were bright with tears he'd never admit to. A baby, he said wonderingly. A new beginning, she agreed. For all of us. As they walked home hand in hand, the ranch spread before them in the setting sun. The burned pasture was already showing new growth. The schoolhouse rang with children's laughter. And in the main house, family gathered. Robert and William had decided to stay, bringing their own families to help rebuild not just the ranch, but the community. The battle was won. But Maggie was right, the real work was just beginning. Building something better, something worthy of the children who would come after. It wouldn't be easy, but then nothing worth doing ever was. No regrets, James asked as they reached the house. Maggie looked at her husband, her home, her family, her future. Not a single one. And in the growing dusk, with their shadows stretched long across the land they'd fought to protect, James and Maggie Carter walked into their house together, ready for whatever tomorrow might bring. The autumn air carried a hint of smoke and promise as James stood on the ridge overlooking his ranch. 6 months had passed since the confrontation with Blake. 6 months of rebuilding not just fences and faith, but an entire way of life. Below, he could see Maggie in the garden, her condition now obvious, directing the planting of winter vegetables with Rosa. Never thought I'd see you smiling at turnips, Robert said, joining him on the ridge. I'm not smiling at turnips, James replied, his eyes never leaving his wife. No, Robert agreed. You're smiling at everything you thought you'd never have. He paused, then added, You know there's still talk in town. There always will be. Doesn't bother you? James finally looked at his brother. What bothers me is that I almost let their poison keep me from her, that I nearly chose my pride over my heart. In the garden below, Maggie felt their gaze and waved. The simple gesture still made James's chest tight with emotion. She's changed you, Robert observed. She's saved me, James corrected, from becoming something cold and bitter and alone. The transformation hadn't been easy. In the aftermath of Blake's downfall, James had faced hard truths about himself and the man he'd become. Success had armored him against hurt, but also against joy. Maggie had stripped that armor away, leaving him vulnerable but alive in ways he'd forgotten were possible. Mr. James! Young Miguel came running, his back healed but scarred. Riders coming, lots of them! James tensed, hand moving to his gun, but Miguel was grinning. It's okay. They're carrying a white flag. The delegation that arrived was unexpected Judge Morrison, Reverend Thompson, the new sheriff, and several prominent townspeople who'd remained neutral during the conflict. They dismounted nervously, clearly uncomfortable on Carter land. Gentlemen, James greeted them coolly. To what do I owe this honor? Judge Morrison, elected spokesman, cleared his throat. Mr. Carter, we've come to... That is, the town council has met, and we... He fumbled to a stop. What the judge is trying to say, the Reverend stepped in, is that we've come to apologize, and to ask for your help. My help? James's eyebrow rose. The town is dying, Sheriff Coleman said bluntly. He was new, brought in from Houston, with no patience for politics. Blake's poison went deep. Families are leaving. Businesses are closing. We're tearing ourselves apart. And this concerns me because, like it or not, you're the biggest employer in 3 counties. Morrison found his voice. Your ranch drives this economy. When you pulled back, stopped shopping in town, stopped hiring townfolk. You mean when the town tried to burn us out and destroy our lives? Maggie's voice came from behind them. She'd approached silently, magnificent in her righteous anger despite her swollen belly. When you stood by while thugs threatened children and beat innocent boys. The delegation had the grace to look ashamed. Mrs. Carter. Reverend Thompson stepped forward. You're right. We failed in our Christian duty. We let fear and prejudice guide us instead of love and compassion. I'm deeply sorry. Maggie studied him for a long moment. Words are easy. Reverend, what are you prepared to do? Whatever it takes to heal this community, he said simply. Starting with a public apology from the pulpit this Sunday, and... He hesitated, then forged ahead. We'd like you to return to the church. Both of you. Your example could help bridge the divide. Our example, James laughed harshly. The fallen woman and the fool who married her. The woman who showed grace under persecution, and the man who stood by love against all opposition. Thompson corrected gently. If that's not a Christian example, I don't know what is. Maggie placed a hand on James's arm, their silent communication speaking volumes. Finally, she spoke. We'll consider it, but understand this: we won't pretend the past didn't happen. If we come back, it's as ourselves, not as some sanitized version to make others comfortable. That's all we can ask, Morrison said. After they left, James and Maggie walked to their favorite spot by the creek. The cottonwoods were turning gold, leaves falling like coins into the water. Do you trust them? James asked. I trust that they're scared, Maggie replied. The question is whether fear of economic ruin is enough to overcome their prejudices. And if it's not, she turned to face him, taking his hands. Then we continue as we are, building our own community here, teaching children who want to learn, creating something new. Is that enough for you, this isolation? James Carter, you dense man, she said with fond exasperation. Haven't you figured it out yet? You're my whole world. Everything else is just scenery. He kissed her then, there by the creek where it all began, and felt again that rightness that came with holding her. The following Sunday, they attended church for the first time since their wedding. The congregation rippled with whispers as they entered, but Reverend Thompson was true to his word. His sermon on judgment and redemption was pointed, and his public apology brought tears to many eyes, including Maggie's. Slowly, tentatively, the community began to heal. Not everyone was ready to forgive or forget, but enough were willing to try. The school Maggie had started grew, now including town children whose parents valued education over old prejudices. James resumed business in town, his presence a reminder that prosperity and principles could coexist. But the real test came with the winter storm. It struck in early December, a blizzard that old-timers said was the worst in 40 years. Snow piled up to the windows, temperatures plummeted, and families throughout the county found themselves in desperate straits. We have to help, Maggie said, pacing despite her advanced pregnancy. People will die. It's not our responsibility, James pointed out, though his heart wasn't in the argument. Isn't it? She faced him. We have food, shelter, warmth. Can we sit here in comfort while neighbors freeze? Of course they couldn't. James organized rescue parties, sending ranch hands with supplies to stranded families. The house became a refuge, filling with those who'd lost heat or shelter. Former enemies sat side by side at their table, sharing soup and warmth. Eleanor Patterson was among the last brought in, half frozen and alone, her house having lost its roof to the storm's fury. She could barely look at Maggie, shame and pride warring in her face. I'm Mrs. Patterson, Maggie said gently, offering her warm clothes. You're welcome here. Eleanor broke down crying. After everything I said, everything I did, is forgiven, Maggie finished. We all make mistakes. What matters is what we do next. The storm lasted 3 days. By the end, the Carter Ranch had sheltered over 50 people. Children played together regardless of their parents' past conflicts. Women who'd shunned Maggie now helped her prepare meals. Men who'd ridden with Blake worked alongside ranch hands to keep everyone safe. When the snow finally stopped, something had fundamentally changed. The shared danger, The common struggle for survival had broken down barriers that might have stood for generations. "You did this," James told Maggie as they watched their guests prepare to leave. "You opened our home, our hearts. You showed them who we really are." "We showed them," she corrected, then gasped, hand going to her belly. "Maggie, I think—" "Oh," she gripped his arm. "James, the baby." Chaos erupted. Rosa flew into action, ordering hot water and clean linens. The women who were about to leave immediately volunteered to help. Even Eleanor Patterson, surprising everyone, proved to have midwifing skills. "Learned it from my mother," she said briskly, taking charge. "Now, Mr. Carter, you need to leave." "I'm not going anywhere," James said firmly. "James," Maggie managed between contractions. "Please, let the women work." He kissed her forehead, torn between tradition and his need to stay close. Finally, Robert and Tom bodily removed him to his study, where he paced like a caged wolf. The hours crawled by. Outside, the sun set on a world transformed by snow, everything clean and new. Inside, life fought its way into being, accompanied by Maggie's determination and the encouragement of women who'd once been enemies. Just after midnight, a cry split the air, not of pain, but of new life. James was moving before the sound fully registered, bursting into the room despite all protocol. "A son," Eleanor said, tears streaming down her face as she placed the baby in Maggie's arms. "A perfect, healthy son." James sank to his knees beside the bed, reaching out with trembling fingers to touch the tiny face. The baby's eyes opened, unfocused but alert, and James felt his heart completely surrender. "He's beautiful," he whispered. "He's ours," Maggie said, exhausted but radiant. "James, we have a son." The news spread quickly. By morning, despite the snow, gifts began arriving: hand-carved toys, knitted blankets, preserves, and goods from families throughout the county. Each represented not just a gift but a peace offering, an acknowledgement of change. Reverend Thompson arrived to bless the child. "Have you chosen a name?" James and Maggie exchanged glances. They discussed this. "Thomas James Carter," Maggie announced. "After the best friend who stood by us when the world stood against us." Tom Brennan, tough as leather and twice as weathered, actually sniffled. As the impromptu celebration continued downstairs, James and Maggie retreated to their room with their son. The baby slept between them. Tiny fingers curled around one of Maggie's. "Look what we made," she marveled. "Out of scandal and storm and struggle, this perfect life. He'll have better than we did," James vowed. "No poverty, no shame, no closed doors." "And he'll know love," Maggie added. "Real love, not just duty or expectation." A knock interrupted them. Rosa entered with a telegram that had somehow made it through the snow. James read it, his expression shifting to wonder. "It's from Washington, the territorial governor. He's appointing me to the Cattle Commission. Says the territory needs men of proven integrity and moral courage." Maggie laughed, startling the baby. "From pariah to moral example in 6 months, only in America." "Only with you," James corrected, kissing her softly. As dawn broke over the snow-covered ranch, painting the world in shades of rose and gold, the Carter family lay together in their bed, no longer outcasts or scandal, but simply a man, woman, and child facing the future together. Downstairs, the last of their storm guests prepared to leave, but they'd be back for the school, for business, for the community that was slowly, carefully, being rebuilt on a foundation of forgiveness rather than fear. "I choose you forever," James whispered, echoing his promise from the cabin. "Forever and always," Maggie agreed, their son sleeping peacefully between them. And in that moment, with the storm past and the sun rising on a changed world, forever seemed not only possible, but inevitable. 5 years had passed since the winter storm that changed everything. The Carter Ranch had grown beyond even James's ambitious dreams. But it was the changes to the community that truly marked their success. Where once there had been division and prejudice, now stood unity and purpose. Maggie stood in the doorway of the new schoolhouse, a proper building now, with real glass windows and a bell tower that could be heard across the valley. 23 children filled the benches, their voices raised in morning recitation. Among them sat Thomas, now 5 years old, his father's gray eyes bright with his mother's spirit. Mrs. Carter. Sarah, one of her first students, now assisted with teaching. The governor's party just passed through town. They'll be here within the hour. Maggie smoothed her dress. No longer the faded calico of her youth, but still simple and practical. The territorial governor was coming to see what everyone now called the Willow Falls Miracle, a community that had transformed itself from bitter division to cooperative prosperity. "Sarah, please continue with the lesson. I need to find my husband." She found James at the new community center they'd built where the old Blake Saloon had stood. He was deep in discussion with Tom Brennan and several other ranchers about the upcoming cattle drive, now a cooperative effort that benefited everyone. "The governor's almost here," she said quietly. James looked up, and even after 5 years, the way his face softened when he saw her made her heart skip. "Then we'd better make ready. Tom, we'll finish this later." As they walked back to the main house, hand in hand, they passed the other changes they'd wrought. The medical clinic, staffed by a real doctor they'd convinced to relocate from San Antonio. The library, filled with books donated from across the territory. The community garden where families of all backgrounds worked side by side. "Nervous?" James asked. "Should I be? We're just showing him what's possible when people choose hope over hate." "When the right people lead the way," he corrected, squeezing her hand. The governor's party was impressive, 6 carriages and a mounted escort. Governor Samuel Houston himself stepped down, older now but still commanding. Beside him came his wife and several territorial officials. "Mr. Carter, Mrs. Carter." The governor greeted them. "I've heard remarkable things about your community. You honor us with your visit, Governor." James replied, "The honor is mine. It's not often we see a town resurrect itself from near death. I'm eager to understand how you accomplished it." The tour began at the schoolhouse. The governor's wife was particularly impressed to find girls learning alongside boys, and children of Mexican ranch hands seated next to those of Anglo merchants. "Education is the great equalizer," Maggie explained. "When children learn together, they're less likely to hate each other as adults." Young Thomas ran up during recess, stopping short at the sight of strangers. "Mama, is it true the governor has 100 horses?" Thomas Maggie blushed. "Mind your manners." But Houston laughed. Kneeling to the boy's level, "Not quite 100, young man, but I do have some fine ones. Do you like horses?" "Yes, Sir Papa's teaching me to ride. He says I'm a natural, just like him." "Thomas, why don't you show the governor's wife your drawings?" Maggie suggested. And the boy eagerly complied. As they continued the tour, Houston pulled James aside. "Your boy seems bright. He takes after his mother. And he'll grow up without the prejudices that nearly destroyed this place. That's our hope. Him and his sister." James smiled at Houston's raised eyebrow. "Margaret's expecting again. Another 2 months. Congratulations. Large families build strong communities." They visited the medical clinic, where Dr. Martinez was treating patients regardless of their ability to pay another innovation funded by the Carter fortune, but supported by the entire community. The cooperative store, where profits were shared among members. The town hall, where decisions were made by elected representatives from all parts of society. But it was at the community center that Houston seemed most moved. Eleanor Patterson, now a widow but also now a friend, was teaching a quilting class to women of all backgrounds. In the next room, Robert Carter led a meeting about expanding the railroad spur to Willow Falls. Children played in the yard while their parents planned a future together. "This is remarkable," Houston said quietly. "When I received reports of the troubles here 5 years ago, I feared we'd lose the town entirely. Instead, you've created something special." "We nearly did lose it," James admitted. "Hate and fear nearly destroyed us all. It took almost losing everything to realize what truly mattered." "And what was that?" James looked across the room to where Maggie was helping a young mother with a fussy baby. "That wealth means nothing if you're alone. That respectability built on cruelty is worthless. That love, real love, is worth any risk." Houston nodded slowly. "I've been in politics a long time. Mr. Carter, I've seen communities torn apart by far less than what you faced here, what you and your wife have accomplished. It gives me hope for our entire territory." That evening, a celebration was held in the governor's honor. The entire community gathered, ranchers and farmers, merchants and laborers, Anglo and Mexican, all united in pride for what they'd built together. Maggie found a quiet moment with Margaret Houston, the governor's wife. "It hasn't been easy," she admitted. "There are still some who resent me, who whisper about my past, but most have moved forward. Change is never easy." "Mrs. Houston replied, "But you've shown that it's possible. My husband speaks often of the need for moral leadership in the territory. After today, I think he's found some." As the evening progressed, James was called upon to speak. He stood before the assembled crowd, Maggie at his side, Thomas sleepy in her arms. "5 years ago, this community nearly tore itself apart," he began. "We let fear and prejudice guide us. We forgot that we're all human, all struggling to build something better for our children." He paused, looking out at faces that had once shown him hatred, now showing respect. "We learned that prosperity means nothing without community. That tradition isn't worth preserving if it's built on cruelty. That sometimes the greatest courage is admitting you were wrong. We've built something here together, not perfect, but good, growing, alive. And we did it by choosing to see each other as neighbors, not enemies, by choosing love over fear." He raised his glass. "To Willow Falls, to second chances, to the future we're building together." The toast was echoed throughout the room, even by those who had once been his fiercest opponents. As the celebration continued, James and Maggie slipped outside for a moment of quiet. They walked to the small grove of oak trees they'd planted, one for each year since their marriage, and now one for Thomas. Soon there would be another. "Did you imagine this?" Maggie asked, leaning into his warmth. "When you hired the desperate shop girl, did you imagine we'd be here?" "When I saw you in that pool," James said softly, "I imagined nothing beyond the next moment. You've given me so much more than I ever dared dream." "We've given each other," she corrected. "That's what makes it work." Thomas had followed them out, and now tugged at James's coat. "Papa, tell me the story again." "Which story, son?" "About how you saw Mama at the swimming hole and fell in love forever." Maggie blushed, even after all these years. "Thomas, that's not exactly—" "It's close enough," James said, scooping up his son. "Once upon a time, there was a very foolish man who thought money was all that mattered." As he told the story, edited for young ears, more children gathered. Sarah's little ones, the Martinez children. Others drawn by James's voice and the promise of a tale. Soon they had an audience sprawled on the grass, looking up with rapt attention. "And then what happened?" one child asked. "Then," Maggie took over. "The man learned that love is worth more than all the gold in Texas, and the woman learned that sometimes the best things come from the worst situations." "Like flowers from cow manure," Thomas added helpfully, making the other children giggle. "Exactly like that," James agreed, ruffling his son's hair. Later, after the governor's party had retired and the celebration wound down, the Carters returned home. Rosa had kept the house running smoothly, as always, and welcomed them with her usual warmth. The governor, he seemed impressed. She observed, "He should be," Maggie said, sinking gratefully into a chair. "This community has done something remarkable." "No," Rosa corrected gently. "You two have done something remarkable." The community followed. As they prepared for bed, Thomas already asleep in his room, James and Maggie stood at their window looking out over their land. The moon was full, bathing everything in silver light. In the distance, they could see the lights of town, more numerous now than 5 years ago as families moved in, drawn by the promise of a place where anyone could build a future. "I love you," James said suddenly. "I don't say it enough." "You say it every day," Maggie replied. "In how you treat our son, how you lead this community, how you look at me across a crowded room. Words are nice, but actions speak louder." "Then let me act," he said, pulling her close. They stood there, holding each other, thinking of all they'd overcome and all that lay ahead. Another child coming, the ranch thriving, the community growing, their love deepening with each passing year. "Do you ever regret it?" James asked. "The easy life you could have had if you'd married someone suitable." Maggie laughed, the sound rich with genuine mirth. "James Carter, you are the most suitable man I know. Suitable for me, suitable for our children, suitable for this life we've built. I wouldn't change a single moment. Not even the scandal, the pain. Especially not that. It made us who we are. It brought us together." She placed his hand on her growing belly. "It gave us this." As if in response, the baby kicked. James's face lit up with wonder, as it had with Thomas, as it would with every child they were blessed with. "Forever," he whispered, echoing the promise made so long ago. "Forever and always," she confirmed. And in their home built from dreams and determination, surrounded by a community transformed by their courage, James and Margaret Carter faced their future together, not as the rich cowboy and the desperate shop girl, but as partners, parents, leaders, and above all, two people who had chosen love over fear and never looked back. The oak trees in their grove would grow tall and strong, sheltering future generations who would know nothing of the prejudice that once divided their town. Children would play beneath their branches, learning the story of how love conquered hate, how courage defeated fear, and how two unlikely people changed the course of history simply by choosing each other. It was, as Thomas would say when he grew older, a love story for the ages, but more than that, it was a testament to the power of redemption, the strength of community, and the enduring truth that love, real, honest, courageous love, can indeed conquer all. Thank you so much for listening to this story of love, redemption, and the power of choosing hope over fear in the Old West. I'm curious to know where in the world you're enjoying this tale. Please share your location in the comments below so we can connect and discuss what touched your heart in James and Maggie's journey. If this story moved you, please subscribe to Wild West Night for more tales of passion and courage from the American frontier. Don't forget to like this video and hit that hype button to help more listeners discover this story of how love can transform not just two hearts, but an entire community. Until our next adventure in the Wild West, keep believing in the power of love to change the world.